Hey, everybody, and welcome back to the YMS podcast. My name is Colin Mansfield. I am joined today by the illustrious Ryan Wiggin from ABI Research. Want to say hi, Ryan?
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me, Colin.
Yeah, absolutely. Ryan and I have known each other for a few years now. And when I was thinking about potential podcast guests to have on the show, sort of to bring the show back in a sense and kind of kick things off, Ryan was one of the first people that popped into my head. Very knowledgeable about the space, but also about the industry in general. And there's not many people, I think, that fit that description. Most people that are knowledgeable about the space are working for a company in the space. So it's fun to have you on here, Ryan. I wonder if you could tell me a little bit, and I mean, I know, but I suppose for our listeners, a little bit about ABI Research. What do you guys do? What's your goal? And then how do you fit into that picture? What's your role there?
Yeah, absolutely. So ABI Research, we're a market intelligence firm. So we support both technology providers and end users and system integrators that sit within that. So we like to see ourselves really sitting at the intersection between the technology and kind of the end user. So we try and decipher, what are the emerging technologies within the space and within industry, and what does that mean kind of for the next kind of going forward. So my role is within the supply chain management and logistics service. So we cover anything from freight transportation to warehouse and fulfillment to site and yard management as well. And really within that, we started covering the yard management space a few years ago. Quite a rapidly evolving space, and we've kind of focused on it from a few different angles. So we always look at it from a technology perspective, but also look at end user pain points as well. And we have a global perspective, look at it across industries as well. So really try and look at the nuances and how the pain points differ. So that's really kind of my specific coverage. Obviously, supply chain covers a lot of different things, a lot of moving parts. But we've kind of seen that kind of merge quite a lot over the last few years with some more interconnected solutions. And I think there's still a lot to detail, especially in the age of AI at the moment. Obviously, I'm sure that's the main question on everyone's mind, especially being a technology research firm. So again, that's kind of a big part of what we're doing at the moment as well.
No, that's great. But how did that start? Was it just sort of like, hey, Ryan, you're on yard management, or was it something that you got to? Did you pick straws and you got the lowest straw, or how did that how did that work on your end?
Yeah, sure. So I think it kind of started off. I mean, we go to a lot of industry events. Obviously, we
Yeah.
speak to a lot of the industry, speak to a lot of end users as well. And really, I think when we first started looking at it, it came from a few different colleagues who were saying, from all different areas, from networks coverage to IoT coverage to transport coverage, basically said, we're hearing a lot about yard. The word yard has cropped up a lot of different, even events that aren't even related to supply
Mhm.
chain. The word yard management was coming up a lot more. So it was kind of just put on my desk really to say, can you look into this space, what it means, what's going on? And yeah, it sort of opened up a new world really, because we originally we'd been focused a lot on the transport and then the warehousing and site, and I think that intersection kind of hadn't come in that much into a lot of people's minds. So it came from a few different colleagues, all within a space of about 2 months. And I thought, well, if this many different people are hearing it, surely it's definitely a buzz that needs to be looked into.
So not the short straw, then more like, hey, this is actually worth it. That's cool.
100%, yeah.
When that came across your desk, when you started sort of looking into it, I imagine that you probably walked in with some assumptions or preconceived notions, especially since other spaces in logistics have, from a technological standpoint, are established and have been around for, in some cases, decades. What did you expect to find in the yard management space? And then what did you actually find when you first sort of encountered this sort of corner of the supply chain?
Mm. So, I mean, I expected to find not a lot, to be brutally honest. I think I think before you start looking at that space, it's very much seen as just it's always been the kind of forgotten part of the supply chain, right? The sort of, and there's a reason why it's often been called like the black hole in terms of visibility, because a lot of people just don't really know what's going on there. I think a lot of times it was very much just seen as you drive through a gate, you go to a dock door, you unload, and you leave essentially. But I think really when you start to dive into it, and it was kind of a fascinating world to sort of dive into when you look at it, how different industries are managing that, from manufacturing all the way to how e-commerce is kind of creating a lot more volume going through these yards as well in terms of transit running through. So I think, yeah, as to kind of directly to answer your question, I didn't expect to find as much variability, I think, across industries. and also as much of an impact that technology can have, not just on the yard itself, but I think on the adjacent operations, both the transport and the warehouse. I think one of the kind of most alarming stats I came across originally was, I think it was somewhat over 80% of transport delays stem from a problem within the yard. So goes to show, if you can nail that piece, then I think you solve a lot of your adjacent operations problems as well.
Yeah, no, I've heard that same stat. I think it's interesting because um, there's no, we think of the supply chain as, just all interconnected. I've used the analogy, a series of dominoes. Any one of those dominoes sort of tips over, just affects everything else. And I think that is true. And still, some dominoes are larger than others. And I think that that's why companies pay so much in and invest so much in technologies, to figure out, okay, where are the knobs that I can turn to drive the efficiency, to make things cheaper, to service my customers better, whatever. And this is sort of like a dusty knob in the corner of the control panel with spider webs on it, that a lot of people go, I don't really want to touch that. And it seems like finally it's getting a little bit of attention. It's interesting how your story kind of mirrors mine.
Mm.
When I came to this industry originally, I had very little interest in logistics, and the idea of yard management. I thought, well, man, is that like landscaping? What is that? Like, what do you mean yard management? And sort of peeling that onion back a couple layers and just going, holy cow, man, there's so much here that a lot of people don't know about. There are people that work in this industry for 30, 40 years that are still just looking at their kind of one vertical and going deep on that. That's one reason why I love logistics and supply chain, is there's just so much depth. And you think you know something, and then all of a sudden something happens, you go, wow, okay, that's completely different than I expected. So from your perspective at ABI Research, from the conversations that you've had, you've talked to a lot of vendors in this space. How would you describe the current state of yard management this year in 2026? What's different about this year that you're hearing versus any other year?
Sure. I think what's happened and how it's changed over the last 2 years to now really is, I think there's, the way I like to say it is, kind of now 100% awareness, but still only about a 20 to 30% sort of uptake or actual kind of deployment of extensive yard management. And I say that because I think, about 2 years ago, there was a real kind of push to say, oh, we need to start thinking about the yard, what it means for operations, what we can actually do there. And I think over the last 2 years, it's become a very ingrained part of companies' sort of psyches. Really, I think we did a massive survey towards the end of last year, and we asked about what are your investment, what are you looking to invest in with over the next 48 months, so going into this year and into 2027 as well. And the very few were saying no investment in yard management. It was the vast majority were exploring new solutions, or actually taking single solutions and deploying them across multiple sites. So I think there's a complete awareness now. But I think there's still quite a lot of variance. I think that one of the reasons that often holds a lot of companies back, and what we've seen a lot again over the last year, is this awareness that they need a yard management solution, but their specific needs in their specific industry and their particular niche, and how big the site is, or what their particular pain points are, really, that's the challenge, to say, well, okay, we know what we've got, but we don't know how that matches up with some of the solutions out on the market. And in comparison to some other areas, whether you're looking at your kind of WMS or TMS, are very well established. Yard management is still quite niche, really. I mean, there's not as many providers out there, providing these services. So I think there's still that kind of learning curve for a lot of companies that are saying, okay, we know what we want to do, or they've started something, but they just don't quite know maybe how to take that to the next level.
It's interesting that you say that. So I have found that to be true to some extent as well. There's this level of education that always has to happen, typically, and depending on the level of pain that a client's experiencing, sort of is inversely proportional to the level of education that needs to be provided for, right? Because they'll probably have done some research once the pain gets bad enough, but which is part of where you guys come into play. But so thank you. But it's interesting because we were doing a meeting with a client, a quarterly business review with one of our clients who's been with us for several years. And what we did is we pulled up their original goals and challenges and what they had been experiencing back in 2022 or 2023. And then compared them to the data that we pulled, the last 6 months worth of data in our system, and we said, look at this delta. Look at how much better things are. And this was after going through and contextualizing that data with them. Hey, are we correct in this? This is what it looks like from our side. Is that what you're seeing on the ground? And getting the 2 thumbs up on that. And that was to the order of doubling or I should say it this way: drivers doing moves twice as fast. Yard drivers used to take 15 minutes to do moves. Now they're taking 7. They saw a FTE reduction in the number of yard drivers they needed, and that was 2. A 2 times FTE reduction. So it's just interesting after we met with them, going over those numbers, we came back and we said, hey, here's a few additional features, here's a few additional workflows that we think might help you guys kind of get to that next level. And the quote that they gave us was, man, when we first brought you guys on, we thought we were so fancy for bringing on a yard management system. Now with this stuff you just showed off, it feels like almost like an embarrassment of riches. Like, we didn't even know some of this stuff was out there. So it's fascinating how I think many operations, even thinking through their challenges, even when they know a YMS, still can sell themselves short to some degree, rather than going for, well, what would it look like to fully automate this portion of the yard, or this, how can we speed up the gate process beyond just, somebody filling out a tablet even. So I've heard it said, digitization is the first step and then automation is the second. There's lots of ways to frame this idea. But that's certainly borne out, even just in our customer base that have been with us. That education is not a one-time thing. It's an ongoing thing. So one of the things we've noticed is kind of on that same topic, that when we're talking to new clients, there seems to be now a higher level of understanding about yard management overall, as if the net sort of brain, I don't know, understanding of what a yard management system is and how it could benefit has sort of risen. What do you think has changed in the last 3 to 5 years that's bringing more attention and investment to this space? Do you think that's just straight up sort of a better understanding, more resources being out there to be able to get that? Or do you think that there's something else driving that from your guys' angle and actually having talked to many of these companies?
Yeah, I think one of the kind of the big waves that's pushed a lot of it is it's been the general shift in the supply chain and moving from siloed visibility to this idea of end-to-end visibility. Now, I came from kind of the operational side of the supply chain. I'm very aware that end-to-end visibility is not there. The supply chain has far too many nodes, and when we talk about end-to-end, we're talking all the way from sourcing all the way to the end consumer. Now, getting end-to-end visibility is very, very difficult. You kind of have to work on it from a piece-by-piece basis. You're working with multiple different stakeholders, multiple different suppliers. But I think it's definitely got better. Companies have pushed for that end-to-end visibility. And I think as they've done that, they've kind of gone beyond the traditional silos of your warehousing or your manufacturing or your transport. And then they've gone, okay, there's another piece here that we need to be looking at. And I think with the additional visibility of those adjacent operations, it's sort of saying, well, we've got visibility now that our transport delays are not because there was traffic on the road or there was an issues at the port. It was actually because, there was a 2-hour, 3-hour yard delay that we weren't expecting. So I think with that additional visibility has come a better understanding that, okay, here's a piece of the puzzle that we weren't originally looking at that we probably should, because that's where I think some of the pain points are in. So I think that's kind of been the major driver as to how people have come to be more aware, I think, of the kind of the yard environment. But I mean, and another major one really, it always comes down to labor constraints, particularly if we're looking, across North America and Europe. That only continues to change. I mean, the cost of labor and just general labor availability, and I think that's become a real difficulty across multiple nodes of the supply chain. I think particularly in the yards, there are some kind of really sort of shocking stats when you bring in a yard management solution, how much more efficient the workers that you have become. And I think, a lot of sites rely a lot on agency staff. And I think that, again, that's a huge cost to a business. And I think if you can drive those efficiencies, I think naturally then your labor problem does start to drop. So I'd say those are kind of the two main ones, really. It's the visibility and understanding of it, but then also just labor comes into kind of most conversations as, one of the key drivers there.
I wanted to double click on something that you said at the beginning of that. That was interesting. That all of that is interesting and helpful. But you mentioned that the idea of end-to-end visibility is to some degree a farce, or it requires, it's more than just, hey, oh, go with this one vendor, which I completely agree with. And I think most people would, just in general, if I wanted, end-to-end visibility of my house, I wouldn't, just ask one company or pretend that one product would give that to me. I would probably invest in, security systems of different kinds and have layers and all of that. So I think it makes intuitive sense. But when you apply that to the relationship with a vendor, for example, we did this podcast episode many moons ago where we talked about what we refer to. This may not be an industry term, but we refer to it as bolt-on yard management systems, which are typically YMSs that come with another product. But a better way to think of this is they're a sort of tertiary product to some other main product. Typically, a WMS system is a classic example of this. And we don't need to name any vendors. People kind of already know who some of those big players are. They will, provide a primary product and then a secondary product of something like a yard management system. And they may have other secondary products as well as potential upsells to go, oh yeah, we checked the box, we get that. That can help on RFPs, that can help win business when a company's going, oh, so I don't have to buy multiple systems. What we've seen on our end is that many of those companies that invest in sort of the end-to-end package end up coming to us as a dedicated YMS vendor later on and going, this isn't servicing, like we've outgrown it. We've added, additional yard spaces, we've added entire additional facilities, and it's no longer scaling with us in the way we had hoped. So it's not so much a sunk cost fallacy, but it is sort of like a promise that doesn't come to fruition often, it seems. I'm curious if that is what you see in the market as well, is a sort of turn to a series of dedicated vendors, or do you think there's room for everybody to play in that? What does the data say?
Yeah, definitely. So one of the big things we do at ABI Research, we always track kind of the provider landscape and try and understand, is there going to be a market consolidation? So, we see that in tech. There's the kind of the hype cycle, and then there's the sort of realization and consolidation, and we see that across the space. And I think when we're looking at it, we're trying to understand from a provider perspective, are you ultimately solving the end user's problems? And I think again, kind of a couple of years ago, there was this move towards, okay, we want to establish end-to-end visibility. The only way of doing that is to go with one company that is able to, attach every single node of the supply chain. I think what you run with an issue there is, one company is not going to be able to be the best at every single point of the supply chain. There's too much variance. There's too much going on. And I think, as technology's developed, integrations have become way easier, way better. When we talked a few years ago about integration concerns as one of the main things when it comes to deploying a new solution. Sure. Again, from the survey data that we achieved last year, I think integration is still part of it, but most companies now can integrate with most other providers in the market. It's not that much of a challenge really anymore. It's pretty standard now. It doesn't come at an extra cost. It's pretty basic thing to offer as a provider. An integration with another well-known management provider. So I think integration's less of a problem now, which means that it opens up that world to end users to say, well, okay, we can go for a dedicated provider at this part of our supply chain that's going to do that job in a very well. And I think again, it depends massively on the company itself. And I think that the variance, again, I keep talking about it, but like the variance of what industry you're in and what size of company you are has a massive impact on that as well. Because, if you're a very small company with very little people in, to actually manage all the providers that you've got, you might look to work with a single provider initially. But as you grow and develop, we talked about as you maybe roll out to more sites or establish more stakeholders, you're probably going to need more systems that can do a lot more to that. And maybe, the solution that you've got as your ERP or your WMS or your supply chain control tower isn't necessarily going to be an expert on yard or transport. So you need to work with those dedicated providers. So I think to answer your question, I think there's absolutely room for many dedicated providers to operate and coexist very well, because there's no lack of business out there. When we're looking at kind of industry uptake, there's still so much space to move into for providers to digitalize these different workflows. And I think as long as everyone get integration right, which I think most providers are doing now, then yeah, I think there's absolutely space for everyone's play.
Yeah, no, that's a great answer, and it's interesting that the data sort of supports what we're seeing as well. It certainly doesn't make it doesn't make how many options there are be any easier on the person making the decision, but it does mean that depending on the size of the company, they don't feel like they have to go with a single vendor. There's much more opportunity for, well, let's spend some time talking to everyone. We see this on RFPs a lot. And sometimes they're pleasantly surprised. They go, wow, we expected that the vendors that kind of provided it all would have what we needed, but it turns out now, after talking to you guys and looking at how things are, how the system works and how you can integrate, to your point, we're now thinking of this a different way. So I love having those conversations. Let's transition for a sec over to kind of the technology side of the house. So we've talked about how there's still, vast majority of companies that are out there, supply chain organizations that would benefit from a YMS do not have one. And on the other hand, you have sort of this gold rush going on now of AI. And everyone's sort of trying to establish themselves and whatever, pieces and products and features that are going to piece with that. I'm curious, as you've talked to companies out there looking for YMSs and also the vendors providing them, does that provide a little bit of like disharmony, so to speak, where it's like we're providing these features, but companies really maybe don't need those immediately. They need like the system in place. Does that sort of resonate with what you're seeing, or is it like, hey, we actually think AI is going to enable a better uptick in people having access to these features or these systems in the first place?
Yeah, there's definitely. I say this a lot. There's really a problem with how fast the tech space moves and kind of where the industry is. The industry's always years behind where technology is. I mean, we're looking things. We're looking at 6G. We're looking at quantum compute. We're looking at technologies that people aren't even understanding how they operate. And AI is still kind of very much within that, in the sense that you've got your traditional AI, machine learning, which has been around for a long time. It's integrated into many systems that are out there now, but you've also got your kind of agentic AI, which is still super early days, still very much in the kind of proof of concept development. And I think, companies will often market, we've got agentic AI capabilities, and you think, well, hang on a minute, you haven't even got the system in place, or we've only just started using it to actually augment some of our, our human workers. And actually we want to have some degree of control. We don't want to just let the system do everything because our data's not in the right place, or we've not integrated everything we want to do. So I think definitely that you've got to kind of cut through the noise and cut through the hype, really. But I think AI is more of an all-encompassing technology, right? I think it's another way of seeing it is not just necessarily saying we want to take away what you're doing and automate it completely, but actually using it, more as a tool, whether it's for integration, whether it's for data normalization, data quality, which are often some of the biggest challenges when it comes to integration. So I think not necessarily talking about how, all these amazing new tools that we have, actually saying, well, okay, a lot of the problems that you have today, here's how we can take that technology that is still relatively futuristic for a lot of companies and bringing it into the day to day and saying, well, here's how it can actually solve what your pain points are right now. And, I think, again, I mentioned it a few times, like big companies, they've got a lot of, massive IT teams internally that they manage their data well. They're probably ready for some, testing some agentic AI capabilities, but, most of the middle market and, small to medium enterprises are still really working on kind of managing those pain points, actually implementing certain solutions and then slowly testing out. And I think they want to see some kind of validation from some of the bigger players in the market before they, start looking at those advanced capabilities. So I think there's definitely still a variant, but I think it's more about kind of taking what's out there on the market and really identifying what your problems are and solving that for today, not trying to solve problems that you might have in 2 years' time or trying to add new efficiencies when actually it's not quite solving the challenges of today. So yeah, I think cutting through the hype's really key.
That's okay. So that's a really good segue because we've done this series on our show in the past called, overhyped or helpful. And so I'm curious from your standpoint, one of the things that jumps out to me as, is it, I know my opinion, but I won't share it until I hear yours, which is specifically about autonomous yards, autonomous yard trucks, robotics. A lot of this stuff has been in the conversation for years, actually. It's in some ways tied to AI, but in many ways, you go to any trade show, you see robotics, that are actively being sold to warehousing and production manufacturing facilities. And I think a lot of people who have worked in the yard go, well, why can't we just do that there? And of course, there are companies doing that, but I'm curious, from your perspective, overhyped or helpful, autonomous yard trucks, robotics in the yard. Do you think that the market is ready for that? Do you think that that's something that is going to be received well in short order, or do we have more of a longer horizon there?
So I'll expand, but I'll give a very quick answer. I think the technology is brilliant and can be very helpful. I don't think the industry is at all there yet. And the reason I say that, I think if you look at warehousing, and you look at warehouse automation, when you look at the majority of warehouse automation, it's conveyor systems, it's storage systems, it's very straightforward, very monotonous tasks. And there's the efficiency gains of adding a robot in. It's quite an easy integration. They've been around again for years. When you look at automated storage and retrieval systems, and everything's very well structured. I think you go out into the yard and structure just goes out the window entirely. And I think when we look at kind of starting, I suppose, with autonomous yard trucks, I think it's absolutely a place where they will be there in the future, and I think there's definitely a space for them because out on the road, there's pedestrians, there's people around, there's other cars, there's other trucks on the road. So autonomous trucking out on the road, I'd almost argue, is a way scarier concept because there is a lot that could go wrong, and the consequences are massive. Whereas in a gated yard, theoretically, there aren't really many humans walking around, or there doesn't need to be if you've got autonomous yard trucks. It's somewhat of more of a structured environment, than maybe out on the road. So I think if you look at it from that perspective, I think there's definitely a possibility for it. And I think in terms of where the market is right now, at ABI, we've kind of gone out and spoke to a lot of the providers, looked at the market, and we don't. Most of it's still very much in proof of concept phase. There's some early deployments, some retrofitting of existing trucks with more autonomous capabilities. I mean, hitching onto trailers has been a problem for a while. Do you use a robotic arm to do that, or do you use? You've also then got vision systems that have to come into play, but for a lot of people, yards aren't structured. They don't have tight lanes to work on. You've got external drivers coming in. How does an autonomous yard truck work with external drivers that maybe are driving around the yard the wrong way? There's all sorts of different things that come into play there. So I think there's absolutely the possibility, but in terms of what we see in the market right now, it's still super early days, still very much in that development proof of concept phase. So I think, and maybe we'll get onto this a little later, but I think in terms of automation, where it is, possible now, I think is more around kind of task execution and, things that the yard management systems are doing today to sort of take those manual tasks away from the human worker that's, having to, key in things manually. I think that's where, and gate automation as well, again, very much in the market now, very much kind of a big improvement to what yards are seeing today.
Yeah, no, I that's what we see as well. We have clients that are trying them out. We have clients that are interested in trying them out. But it is not every client, nor is it something that comes up in, it's very few and far between that new prospective clients come to us with that ask. It's a trade show-ism, I would say, a little bit. More than it is, a reality for most yards. That said, I agree with you. It's one of those, like, maybe overhyped now, but there is a clear through line to getting to where autonomous vehicles are more of the norm. Price plays a big role in that. So does, the ability to sort of, there are timelines associated with even being able to run those pilots. We've had clients in the past that have tried to do sort of the hybrid yard, where they go, okay, we're gonna do autonomous yard trucks for a part of it, and the other part is going to be sort of the standard with actual yard drivers. And that seems to really frustrate the actual yard drivers getting stuck behind the robot trucks and being like, it's the kind of the idea of like, well, autonomous driving over the road will be great when everybody is using that, but when only a subset are, it's kind of dangerous. Sort of same idea, I think. But I also agree, the more control an operation has over their whatever piece of their operation they're looking to automate, the more potential there is for that automation to be successful in a warehouse. If it's all your warehouse, it's all your product, it's all, that very easy to, maybe not easy, but simple from a planning standpoint to, figure out where are the inefficiencies and how can we automate it. The yard, especially if it's not all your own trucks, if you have outside carriers coming in, which most facilities do, it becomes a lot more challenging to, have control over that situation. So that's what we see as well. Yeah, let's talk about that automation in the yard, take it the step further. What are people automating? You mentioned the gate.
Mm-hmm.
I've always used the analogy of like the gate is the first domino to fall in the yard. It's not where the data, it's not necessarily where we want the data to begin, right? We'd love to get an appointment in advance. We'd love to have a driver pre-check. We'd love to, but often the gate is sort of like that first piece. And so that move from the gate to the yard, and then from the yard to the docks, or from the gate to the docks, becomes very, very important, both from a tracking standpoint and accuracy standpoint. I will say that internally at our company, we have come up with the most options of our system around the gate. There are lots and lots of ways that you can solve that gate problem depending on the company. It seems like every time we come up with, okay, this is our list of our product list, somebody comes in and goes, well, we do it this way. Could you tweak that? Okay, time for another revision, So from your standpoint, seeing what companies are investing in the yard management automation space, you mentioned task management, you mentioned gate automation. Where are companies seeing the biggest sort of financial gain, sort of the bang for your buck, if you will, on the automation in the yard?
Yeah, I think a lot of it comes down to translating the visibility into action. So, I talked about it before. I think you can see stuff's happening. There's problems there, but just knowing that they're there isn't actually going to do anything in terms of your bottom line. You're not actually making any gaining new efficiencies if you see the problems, but you can't actually do anything about it. And I think that's been one of the biggest differentiators of solutions over the last couple of years is, okay, you can see what's going on now, but what can you actually do about it? And one of the main ones from a yard perspective is always around kind of detention and demurrage. If you can, if there's alerts cropping up to say, okay, we need to get this stock moving, or these containers off the yard, or these trucks out, that's one part of it. But I think actually understanding how to do that and then actioning that is a really big part of that. So I think whether it's automating communication with kind of external stakeholders or 3PLs or whoever's responsible for moving those containers, for example, that's kind of a big part. And being able to take the manual side of that out and kind of automating that whole process is pretty straightforward, very doable today, and can really kind of help develop some, big cost savings from that perspective. I think another big part of it is kind of that continuous learning of a system. So understanding maybe, proximity, if I've got my yard jockeys running tasks, maybe rather than just handing tasks out, to whoever's available, it's more about, well, okay, who's, qualified to do a certain task within the yard, or who's actually near to the next asset that needs moving, for example. Those very small things that a system can be, well trained and can become very intuitive of, that can make a massive difference kind of later down the line. So I think kind of internally, that's kind of a big piece of it. And then I think, the gate automation piece, like you said, it's not always easy to get all the information you need to automate the gate when a truck arrives. But I mean, just kind of improving the driver experience at your yard. And I think automating some of the processes that, that were previously quite manual for them. There's some really kind of nice interfaces out there now, and driver engagement tools that are kind of smoothing that whole experience. I think it just allows that experience for the driver to be a lot better. They can get dock scheduling, again, is a massive one, making sure that if a driver is routed to the right dock door and that's connected into the warehouse management system, for example, knowing that stock is going to the right part of the warehouse is a huge, differentiator then for, again, the onboard operations. So I think it's not just almost isolated to the yard, but actually if there's automation that runs then across two systems that are talking to each other completely autonomously and understanding where stock should be. Again, I think kind of holistically as an organization, your savings are only going to kind of compound from that point. So I think it's those small kind of isolated automations that are the most doable and actually kind of reap the most value. I think this idea of just saying, well, automation has to be that a human never touches any of it, I think is not really the right way to look at it. I think you've got to look at it in pieces and say, well, how can we automate these single tasks that are going to have the most impact?
Yeah. No, I agree. I mean, that's what stacks up, right? You look at that over time, and reassess. Okay, where are we spending too much time now, and continue to reassess and sort of iteratively improve. In a sense, that is how we look at software engineering. That's how a lot of companies look at building their products. Is there are times for big feature jumps and big feature releases, but more often than not, it is iterative improvement, receiving feedback, reassessing, and then building from there. And so when we think about over time, where yard management has been when you first sort of discovered it as a niche and started interviewing and started running some of these studies, to where it is now, where AI has entered the chat, so to speak, and everybody's kind of talking about that. And where do you think this is all going to end up? When we look 5 or 10 years down the line, are we going to get to that sort of very few people in the yard, it's almost completely autonomous, or is there always going to be a hybrid relationship here, do you think?
Yeah, great question. I think
I'm
the
asking you
question
to
I
rub
had
your
it.
rub your magic lamp here, right?
Yeah, God, I really need to. I really need one because I've been asked this question a few times, and it's hard to obviously. I think if you were looking at it kind of more holistically as a supply chain, I think where we're going is this idea that that everything can be visible and all these processes can be automated. But I think what's kind of proved year on year is that you still need people within every single part of the supply chain with having that kind of touch to it. And I think what as you start to automate these little things like we were just talking about, it's amazing then the kind of new things that are unlocked for human workers to go and do those kind of. He's always talking about, is it going to replace you or allow you to do more higher value tasks? And I think what we've seen more and more in the supply chain is that even though AI keeps coming in, more automation keeps coming in, robotics, we're still talking about labor constraints, which to me kind of shows, well, if you're still worrying about labor and you've got all this automation coming in, I know obviously the one is kind of trying to solve the other, but actually I think there's still such a role for humans because a lot of time with automation you just unlock new things for humans to do. So kind of, I suppose my optimistic view of it is that it will continue to be that kind of hybrid model, and I think the data continues to back that up, right? I think there's still everything just unlocks something new. A new technology comes in and it allows something else to come into play. And I think again, 5 years is not a long time off. For you to ask the same question 5 years ago, and you look at it, there's been a huge amount of change technologically, but the industry still has all the same problems it had 5 years ago. I'm sure all the challenges and pain points. I know kind of 5 years ago, very much in the COVID era, but it's all the same problems. It's all the same constraints. So I don't necessarily see anything major shifting in that respect, but I do see there being much more day-to-day automations and kind of reporting, kind of those tasks that from a data perspective would take a lot of time. I think those things are going to become automated to the point where humans don't have to spend forever looking at screens, looking at their systems to say, well, what's going on? Everything's going to become a lot more mobile as well, and people are going to be able to go and kind of interact a lot more around the yard or the warehouse or the manufacturing facility and have everything with them in their pocket. There's probably going to be a lot more interface as well. We're getting a lot more accustomed to things like ChatGPT and Perplexity, asking systems questions and getting really nice responses. And again, that's I think going to be, we're going to not have to spend as much time looking around documents, and data is going to become a lot more manageable to us. So I think in 5 years' time, I kind of see a bit more of a much more accessible data and insights. And I think hopefully a lot more changes off the back of that. And I suppose within that respect, at that point, really, that's going to allow companies to test out, autonomous yard trucks, more at scale. So I think everything unlocks something else. So I think that's kind of how it will kind of play out, I think, over the next few years.
You know what? I think that's a fair assessment. I think about even just in our business and in, I talk to my friends about what's happening in their businesses from an AI perspective, and certainly, spreadsheets become a lot easier to parse. Man, you're not spending hours, working in the data, and I think you're right. I think that's what AI initially unlocks in a big way is not having to parse a human sitting there having to parse the data, but getting those insights proactively and being able to make decisions faster because of that. And to your point, then spend time on other things. So I think we're aligned there. I am interested to see, because there's been sort of a resurgence of this idea of the kind of facility where you don't have to have, in the future. I think a lot of companies might put this at 15, 20, 30 years more. But where it'll all just be drones and autonomous vehicles. And I guess to that I would say, well, that's great to think about. I've wanted flying cars since I was a kid, personally, and hoverboards since I saw Back to the Future too. But how do these kinds of ideas solve your problems today?
Mm-hmm.
So we did a study, I guess you could call it, informal study with trade show attendees back at this was Modex 2 years ago, where everybody that came by our booth, we asked them to fill out a "what's your biggest pain points in the yard" kind of survey. We had over 200 people stop by the booth, so not a tiny sample size.
Mm.
And over 80%. I mean, it was like the highest challenge by far was visibility, by far. And everything else sort of was secondary. For some organizations, of course, that are paying out the nose in detention fees, that's going to very quickly rise to the top or whatever. But across the board, visibility was still a huge challenge. And I'll tell you, we ask that same question on every demo request we get, on every discovery session we have with new clients, and it is consistently in the top 3 still. So I think that, while, to your point, from a technology standpoint, we like to, okay, we've solved that problem, now let's move on. From a buyer standpoint, from a facility standpoint in the YMS space, they're still looking for the same kind of solution that has been there. There's a democratization of information. It's a lot easier to find answers now. And so I think we're starting to see larger companies sort of self-educate in a sense. I also think that this corner of the industry has just been growing. Companies like ABI Research that come in and go, oh, there's some, we can help people make decisions here. I think it's very helpful from from our vendor standpoint in sending out, links and sort of education materials, both from a marketing as well as from a, one-on-one standpoint, to go, hey, we're not the only ones saying this. Isn't just our marketing team saying this, right? This is being proven by, sort of third-party studies across the board. So, I know we're coming in on a landing hour. I want to ask you a couple more questions, Ryan, if that's okay. What's something, do you think, an assumption that a lot of companies might have when they approach the YMS space that you think is proven wrong or will be proven wrong? When you think about companies that sort of arrive here and they're looking to automate, or they're looking to gain that level of visibility they don't have, what's an assumption a lot of buyers you think come to this corner of the industry with that's just not correct?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. I think one of the main ones I think we see, or maybe definitely one of the assumptions I had, I think, before looking at the space, really was that it is just an extension of your warehouse or your manufacturing or your transport operations. I think kind of seeing it as a bit of a tag on, or seeing it as somewhat a part of that is, it's not wrong. They are completely interconnected, but I think it sort of diminishes what you can do with it when that's the idea that you have. If you're just looking at, well, how is it affecting the stock coming into my warehouse, then you're missing a big portion of it. Or if you're thinking, well, how does it automate the gate, you're missing all of the kind of in-yard and dock operations. So I think assuming that, and I say that because I assumed it, and I've had conversations about it, I think that's when it sort of diminishes what's possible, really. I think from a yard perspective. So that's kind of the main one. I think I've not heard that as much recently, because, again, like we talked about earlier, the attention around the yard has grown massively, and I think people understand it a lot more. But that's like, I think, kind of the main one. I think when you look at it from a system perspective, that can quite sometimes isolate companies when they don't necessarily know that there are genuine, dedicated yard solutions out there that can look at so much, and then also can roll out kind of multi-site as well. I think people every yard is completely different. Even if it's across different regions of the globe, we always talk about how yards in North America are so massively different to yards in Europe, for
Yeah.
example, from a space perspective, and operational pain points are different, and we've covered that a lot at ABI, and it's quite interesting seeing what drives buyers in each part, and I think some of the assumptions are completely different again as part of that. So I think you have to look at it kind of on a case by case basis, but I think you got to the assumption that it is just an extension of either side, I think is one of the things that is very quickly dispelled when people start looking at the market.
Okay. I agree with you. Let's pretend that you're talking to a director of operations or a director of transportation. These titles differ. To your point, sometimes it's the warehousing guy who's looking for a YMS, and
Mhm.
sometimes it's the VP of continuous improvement or whatever. But they've identified, okay, our yard is a pain point. It's inefficient. There are issues happening. There are things out there that are solvable, but they don't know where to start. What would be your advice?
Yeah, I don't know if this is going to come across right, so bear with me, but I think it's best to focus on simplifying rather than innovating too much. And I say that as kind of a good first step to say, rather than thinking, we talked about it earlier, I need to have the latest AI tool that's going to automate all of my movements, all of my dock scheduling, for example. It's actually saying, well, okay, how can we simplify what's already there? There are solutions on the market that can streamline my gate. It doesn't have to be machine vision, fully gate automated where it's reading, truck numbers and then allowing the gate through, that way. It could simply be a QR code that gets sent to a driver. They scan it at a kiosk and they go in. That is as simple, as really as it gets. And relatively cheap solutions out there on the market that can allow for very, very simple, simplified gate automation type of solution. And I think, even within the yard, then ultimately you're not looking at trying to automate all this task execution, all these problems, but really just get drivers in and get drivers out as quick as you can. That's really the purpose of a yard, right? Get the stock drops off and go. That's what the driver wants. That's what the company wants. That's what the operations need. So I think kind of that simplification mindset's the right thing. I think also one of the things that, and this has come up a lot over the last year, and we've talked about it before, is I think leading with security as well is quite a big one. You've got all of your cost savings, you've got detention of demurrage, which has always been a really big driver, and obviously labor constraints. But I think security, just general cargo theft has gone up massively. There's some stats out from the American Trucking Association, how much that's costing the industry each year. I think I've seen crazy stats of it rising kind of annually by sort of 1,500% over the last 3 years in terms of cargo theft. It's costing the US economy over $35 billion per year. Again, another stat I'm just reading from the American Trucking Association. So again, and it's not just people coming in and stealing a few pallets, it's entire trucks that are going because of double brokering, for example. So it's things that may not be in someone's psyche if they've never been a victim of that, but it's something that, is very prolific and is only kind of continuing. So I think kind of going into it the mindset of I can simplify, I can, and I can look at these cost savings, but also I can secure my sites, particularly if you're working from a high value industry. I think that can be massive. And also seeing it as kind of an insurance policy against what might be, you're not just looking at it as a cost saving perspective, but actually if I can get this in place, digitally secure myself, actually I can add a lot of verification steps in that are going to save me potentially millions in the future.
I couldn't agree more. I think that from a change management perspective as well, what you're saying really resonates. I've talked to companies that are using pen and paper and highlighters and clipboards out in the yard, and they're talking about, well, what if we were to take a robot dog and make it do the yard checks? I'm like, well, that's possible, but like, let's take a step back for a minute. Like, let's figure out first off, what's your budget? Let's start there. And so I think it's not that any of those things are silly or bad or wrong thinking, but moving from a very manual, hands-on process to a digitized to an semi-automated, fully automated for any potential portion of the yard, is going to require not just the technology but the user adoption. And so those processes uh, sometimes for some operations are the hardest part to ensure that their employees. We work really hard in our system, not in, and we work hard to add new features, obviously, but the hardest part of adding those features is making them very, very, very simple. And you spend a lot of time in reduction, right? We could have 15 buttons, but then people aren't going to understand what to click. So how do we make this 3 buttons, right? And that kind of principle. And we do that because of the change management side. It just requires training. It requires videos. People need to know what they need to do in the moment where they need to do it, and they shouldn't have to reference a manual every time, right? And so that's I think that's well received by me, and also just in general, a good thing to think about is where are things complicated now that we can make them less complicated, reduce. One area of the yard that I always think about from a gate perspective, look, even if you're interested in automating the gate, but you're not there yet, or you're trying to figure out, well, we have certain security concerns that have to be satisfied before we could fully automate. Step one, what are they filling in on their gate form that they don't need to be? Like, what data are they gathering that could come from an appointment or could come later on in the process that doesn't need to be captured when there's a queue of people waiting to get into the yard, right? And how can we eliminate that, the driver frustration, the gate employee frustration that just echoes down, once they get into the facility? You start there, right? And then go, okay, now can we give them the QR code? Now can we, maybe add a kiosk or a driver self-service, or, where else then can we tweak this? So I'm on board with you very much there. Okay. As we wrap up here, Ryan, I'm curious if you could share a little bit about ABI Research. Where can people find you if they're interested in looking up some of this research that you've been sharing, some of the information that you've been referencing today? Where can they go? Where can they find you online? Guide the listeners.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, ABI Research, type into Google, hit our website, it's really the kind of the main point of all our information. We've got some great AI tools out there on the website as well, which can get you to the information a lot faster, because we've got a wealth of information on our website. We don't just cover yard management, we don't just cover supply chain, we cover everything. So I think what's really nice at ABI is we have our end markets coverage, but we have our technologies coverage as well. So we're looking really in depth at IoT, AI, machine vision, networks, automation, robotics, software. So I think we come at it from so many different angles. I think it kind of helps us, look at it from, okay, what's the problem in the market, and then how can we kind of stitch together these different technologies to ultimately solve, those problems? Because I think it's very easy to kind of, everybody has their day-to-day jobs, everyone gets kind of isolated in what they're looking at. I think kind of taking a step back and sort of understanding, well, okay, how does this connect? Maybe what is another industry doing that maybe our industry should be doing more? So, and that's what we really try and do. A lot of ABI is kind of take insight from different industries and try and bring them in, and advise both sides. We talked about it before, kind of advising not just the technology provider side, but also the end users, kind of what's out there and what can help you. So, really, definitely, I'd say kind of interact on our website. Obviously, reach out to me directly on LinkedIn. Always happy to speak to anyone from any part of the industry or kind of adjacent industries as well, from both sides, and just keep the conversation going. So I think it's one of those spaces that kind of needs these discussions and conversations. I think not just to kind of drive that innovation, but I think actually to sometimes bring the technology landscape sort of back a little bit and say, well, hang on a minute, you've got some amazing innovation, but you need to look at what the problems are today. So that's really what we're trying to do at ABI, and I think that's always looking to speak to anyone that's keen to look at that.
Excellent, man. Excellent. Yeah, no, I've really enjoyed, getting to know you, getting to know your company, talking together. I think I echo that same sentiment. Just it's great to meet and share relationships with people who are like-minded and kind of in some senses trying to all solve the same problems together, trying to help people out. And so, I just really appreciate you coming on the show today. Talking a little inside baseball with me on the yard management space. Always love doing it. Maybe next time we can do it over a beer or something. That would be preferable. I do have tea today though. I tapped into my English roots and decided, I think it's time for some black tea. So
amazing. Yeah, good to see it. No, I think definitely take you up on that beer offer. I think it'd be good to speak in person and not just from two sides of the world over the phone. But no, really appreciate the conversation. Again, I think it's just great to have this discussion and get it out there for people to listen to. So yeah, really appreciate your time. It's been great being on here.
All right, my pleasure. If you're interested in finding more out about yard management solutions, you can go to our website, yardmanagementsolutions.com. We also have a bunch of videos on YouTube. We're going to be posting more, both long form videos as well as a series of short form videos that you can find on our shorts page. If that's what you're into on your lunch break, scrolling through the reels or the shorts, you're going to have some YMS content to help you out there. Otherwise, you're welcome to add me on LinkedIn, Colin Mansfield. Thank you so much for listening. Have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you on the next one.